Let me just take you through some of the highlights from the 52-page document published in the last 15 or 20 minutes or so ago. In it, Boris Johnson says, I accept that the House of Commons was misled by my statements that the rules and guidance have been followed completely at number 10. But when the statements were made, they were made in good faith and on the basis of what I honestly knew and believed at the time. I did not intentionally or recklessly mislead the House on the 1st of December 2021, the 8th of December 2021, or on any other date. I would never have dreamed of doing so. He said it is clear from the investigations carried out by the committee and by Sue Gray, there's no evidence at all that supports an allegation that I intentionally or recklessly misled the House. The only exception is the assertions of the discredited Dominic Cummings, which are not supported by any documentation. Throughout the report, it repeatedly comes back to Dominic Cummings and their not brilliant current relationship. He says that a suggestion that we would have held events which were obviously contrary to the rules and guidance and allow those events to be immortalised by the official photographer is implausible. The committee, in its initial documents, which were put out a couple of weeks ago, said it seemed obvious that the rules were being broken from the pictures that were taken. He says it was implausible that it had got the official photographer to take a photo of a rule-breaking event. He also goes on to attack the committee. He says, in particular, the committee has gone significantly beyond its terms of reference. He says that in order to prove contempt, it's necessary for the committee to establish I intended to mislead the House, which I clearly did not. He says it's important to record my disappointment at the highly partisan tone and content of the report put out by the committee. He says, when I spoke in Parliament on the 1st and 8th of December 2021, I did not know that any of the events that I attended later escalated beyond what was lawful after I left. So he's making the point that on some occasions, basically the drinking continued after he left. He said, nor was I aware of the existence of many of the events that Sue Gray and the Metropolitan Police subsequently investigated. To this day, it remains, talking about the one event where he was fined, of course, his birthday party. He says, to this day, it remains unclear to me, and I believe the Prime Minister, obviously Rishi Sunak, may feel the same, how precisely we commit an offence under the regulations. He goes on to say, Boris Johnson, no cake was eaten and no one even sang happy birthday. Well, reading it for you so that you don't have to, Lucy Fisher, Times Radio's chief political commentator, joins me from live from Westminster now. Lucy, there's an awful lot of challenge, disagreement, marginal. I mean, I'm not sure we knew that there was no cake eaten. That was marginally interesting. Is there anything here which it lives up to the billing of bombshell dossier, as how it was briefed at the weekend?
Well, Matt, for me, it's really the framing of the two arguments that is key. One is going on very much the severe attack of the committee. He says in particular that it is inappropriate, impermissible and unfair for the committee to have expanded its remit to consider whether he was talking about COVID guidance, which was not legally binding, as well as COVID regulations, which were when he addressed the House. And he also sets out what he describes as his disappointment at the highly partisan tone and content of the committee's interim report. And of course, this is the report in which the committee said it should have been obvious to Boris Johnson that he was breaking rules that he himself had been the ultimate architect of. Boris Johnson says in this written evidence that the committee hadn't yet heard from him, hadn't allowed him to put his side across, and therefore it was sort of unfair what they were alleging in that interim report, and says that they had put forward a selective choice of evidence. They hadn't picked out bits that were favourable to his case. So that's him trying to undermine the integrity of the committee. And I think that obviously we need to step back and realise is aimed at swaying MPs, likely Tory MPs, to vote against the committee if it does find against him. This is a very kind of political attack in some senses. And then obviously he is trying to influence the committee in the first place not to sanction him. And that is why he sort of tries to say that the way that the committee is lining up the question is unfair. You know, he says that they are framing this as a question of whether or not he recklessly misled the House. He says it wasn't reckless, but in any case, the question should be whether he deliberately misled the House. And he lists his reasons for why, in his opinion, it is implausible that that would be the case, including, as you just made clear, Matt, that, he had the official photographer present for 4 of the 5 events that the Privileges Committee are investigating.
And there's also quite a lot riding on him saying, well, my advisors told me that no rules were broken. And clearly what the committee's going to argue is that he was there, he wrote the rules, he attended these events, he could see with his own eyes. In fact, one of the events that they've discussed is the one where Boris Johnson told a group of people in Number 10, this is probably the most unsocially distant gathering in the UK right now. In Boris Johnson's response, he goes on to say what the committee failed to record was the next line of the Number 10 official statement. Boris Johnson had a glass of water in his hand, made a short speech, then went up to his flat. He was the most sensible person there, to be honest. Boris Johnson said he doesn't remember making that joke about it being the most unsocially distanced gathering in the UK right now. Then goes on to say, I might well have made observations in speeches about social distancing and whether it was being perfectly observed. This does not mean that I thought the guidance was contravened. I mean, it feels loosely like tomorrow afternoon is going to be 4 hours of dancing on the head of a pin.
Well, I think that's right, Matt. And I think that in a way, this 50-page dossier with very legalistic language might be treated by some as an attempt at obfuscation. I think when you step back and look at the events, Boris Johnson not denying that he made that joke about social distancing guidance being breached, it does stretch credulity, I think, in the minds of many. So whether this dossier really moves the dial on what the Privileges Committee is clearly thinking, and they've made that clear with this interim report. So far, it is 50 pages. I've got through most of it, but need to rake over it with a fine-tooth comb, as I'm sure those 7 MPs on the committee will be doing. I'm not sure it will necessarily change the dial.
We should also point out in the email sent by the committee, because there's been a bit of a row about why it's not been released before and was the committee doing something to it. The committee says it initially received the written evidence from Mr Johnson on Monday afternoon at 2:32 p.m. in unredacted form. The evidence submitted had a number of errors and typos, and a final corrected version was not submitted to the committee till 8:02 this morning. Redactions have been made in the published version to protect the identity of some witnesses in consultation with Mr Johnson, particularly junior ranking civil servants. Mr Johnson's written submission contains no new documentary evidence.